The concrete was still wet when I stepped out of my truck. Not drying. Not setting. Wet. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the orange steaks. Not the diesel smell. Not the rattle of the chute as the cement truck pulled away. It was the shine. That smooth gray surface sat across the back of my lot like somebody had signed their name where they had no right to touch a pen. I stood there with my keys still in my hand and watched a man in a neon vest drag a finishing tool across a slab that was never supposed to exist. On my property. On the lowest part of my back lot. The part everyone in Willow Bend liked to call useless. The messy strip. The wet corner. The part nobody cared about until they decided it would be convenient if it belonged to them. And in that moment I knew two things. First, somebody had made a very expensive mistake. Second, they still thought they had time before I noticed. My name is Claire Holloway. I live at the back edge of Willow Bend Estates, where the neat little neighborhood gives way to rough ground, drainage swales, and tree lines that were there long before the HOA started mailing glossy newsletters about community pride. If you've ever had neighbors who looked at your property like it was just blank space waiting for their idea, you already know what kind of story this is. If you haven't, stay with me. Because by the time I reached my back lot that morning, they had already poured the first slab. And what happened after that didn't end with a screaming match. It ended with a survey pin, a permit file, a hard rain, and a county inspector asking one quiet question nobody was ready to answer. Who approved this here? I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. No fantasy twist. No miracle ending. Just one bad decision built on another until the paperwork caught up with all of them. From the street, my house looked like every other place in Willow Bend. White siding, blue shutters, trim lawn, a front porch that looked more peaceful than my life ever actually felt. The front half fit the neighborhood. The back half did not. My lot stretched farther than most of the others and dipped behind the last fence line into a rough rear section that bordered a narrow common strip and a walking path. It wasn't scenic. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the kind of backyard people use for family photos. It was just land. Useful land. The ground sloped gently toward a shallow swale that carried runoff during storms. Water from several nearby lots and part of the common strip naturally moved across that lower rear area before draining toward a county culvert beyond the greenbelt. It didn't sparkle. It didn't add curb appeal. It didn't impress anybody. Just worked. And that mattered. A lot of property fights start because one person sees appearance, and the other person understands function. My back lot didn't look important. That was exactly why they underestimated it. I learned how important it was the first spring after I bought the house. We had one of those long Georgia storms that start before sunrise and keep tapping the windows until the whole yard feels soaked and tired. The next morning, I walked the back line in rubber boots and watched runoff trace the same clean path through the low section over and over. Not random puddles. A route. That got my attention. So I went digging. I found the plat map in my closing documents. Then I found the subdivision grading exhibit. Then I found an old county drainage note tied to the original development approval. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an attorney. I work from home doing bookkeeping for small businesses, which means most of my life is receipts, spreadsheets, and people who think, I'll send it later counts as a system. But I understand records. And when something keeps happening on land, there's usually a reason written down somewhere. That rear section was not just some ugly patch behind the fence line. It was doing a job. So I left it alone. I kept it cut back enough that it didn't look abandoned. But I never filled it, never regraded it, never tried to turn it into some polished backyard project with gravel paths and string lights and perfect chairs nobody actually sits in. I respected the shape of the land because the shape of the land was there for a reason. Not everybody in Willow Bend appreciated that. Willow Bend was full of people who used phrases like curb appeal and community standards with the seriousness other people reserve for tax law. People who thought a lawn could tell you everything you needed to know about a person. People who believed matching flower beds were a form of civilization. And nobody embodied that energy more completely than Dana Mercer. Dana lived 2 lots over from me in one of the upgraded brick homes with landscaping so manicured it looked like it had legal representation. She wasn't the HOA president. She was more dangerous than that. She was the volunteer. The enforcer. The woman with a binder at every meeting. The person who said, I'm just trying to help, right before making your life more annoying. If a trash can stayed out too long, Dana noticed. If a mailbox looked too different, Dana noticed. If a basketball hoop felt too permanent, Dana noticed. For the first year, she mostly left me alone. My front yard looked fine. I paid my dues. I didn't make noise. The only thing she ever commented on was my back lot. The first time she brought it up, we were standing at the community mail kiosk in late May, both sweating through our patience. She looked at me over the top of her sunglasses and said, "You know, if you cleaned up that rear section, it would really improve the view from the walking path." I remember asking, "The rear section of my property?" And she smiled like I was being unnecessarily literal. "It doesn't really read like private yard from that angle," she said. That sentence stayed with me. It doesn't read like private yard. Not, I didn't know it was yours. Not, I assumed it was common area. It doesn't read that way. As if ownership were a mood. After that, I started noticing things. A landscaping crew trimming farther back than they needed to. A few temporary utility flags near the common strip that appeared and disappeared within 2 days. People walking farther behind the path than anyone had a reason to walk. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could prove. Just enough to make me start paying attention with purpose. Then the beautification committee happened. Yes, that was real. The board approved a volunteer landscaping initiative after the spring annual meeting. Officially, it was for improving entrances, refreshing common spaces, and adding passive use features in underused areas of the neighborhood. Dana got herself appointed chair. Naturally, a month later, the HOA circulated a concept image for a small pavilion near the rear walking path. Benches, shade cover, decorative plantings, a concrete pad. It looked harmless, but the rendering bothered me. Not because the structure itself was outrageous, because the placement looked off. Too far back, too low, too close to the rear line where the common strip narrowed and my lot widened. So I emailed the property manager, Marlene, and asked a simple question. Can you confirm the exact location of the proposed pavilion? And whether any work is planned near or beyond the common area line adjacent to Lot 18. Her reply came a day later. Concept only. No final placement approved. Owners will be notified if anything moves forward. That should have reassured me. It didn't. Because she answered around the boundary question instead of through it. A week later, I saw Dana walking the rear path with 2 men holding rolled up papers. Then I saw fresh orange stakes appear near the greenbelt edge. Then I saw white utility flags. That was the moment I stopped wondering if I was overthinking, and started documenting properly. Photos, dates, short videos. A folder on my desktop labeled Lot 18 Rear. Nothing fancy, just a file. That file saved me. On Thursday afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found 3 fresh stakes near the rear strip. Not clearly on my lot, but close enough that I grabbed my plat map from the house and walked the line myself. The stakes sat in the kind of position that made one thing very clear. Whoever placed them had either never checked the parcel boundaries, or had decided not to care. I emailed Marlene again. This time, I asked for written confirmation that no work would cross onto my parcel or affect the drainage swale on the rear section of Lot 18. No reply. Friday morning, I saw a contractor truck parked behind the greenbelt access. 2 men were unloading wood forms. That's when my stomach dropped. Walked out there fast and found them laying out for a concrete pad. I asked the older one, "What is this?" He said, "Pavilion pad." I asked where exactly they thought they were. He pointed directly at the back section of my lot. Not the common strip. Not the walking path. My land. I told him clearly that the area was private property. He looked down at a clipboard and said they were told the section beyond the path was association area. I asked who told him that. He hesitated. Then said the project contact was Dana Mercer. Of course it was. I told him to stop. He said they were only setting forms and could verify Monday if there was an issue. If there was an issue. That phrase did something to me. Because at that point the issue was not theoretical. The issue was 2 men setting up construction on land I paid taxes on while speaking to me like I was an optional detail. I photographed everything. The truck. The forms. The stakes. The layout. Then I emailed Marlene again with the subject line, urgent. No construction authorization on Lot 18. I attached the photos and said a contractor was physically staking and forming a concrete pad on my rear parcel, and I was directing all work to stop. Then I called. Voicemail. Then I called again. Still nothing. That evening Dana knocked on my front door. She was smiling. That smile made me angrier than the truck had. She stood there with a folder in her hand and said, "Claire, I heard there was some confusion about the pavilion site." I said, "There is no confusion. Your contractor is on my property." She gave me that patient smile people use when they think calmness equals authority. "The rear low area has always functioned as neighborhood overflow," she said. "It's not really usable private yard." I looked at her and said, "You just called it private." That made her blink. Then she switched tactics. She started using vague committee language. Enhancement. Shared benefit. Adjacency. Underused area. It was all fog. So I asked one direct question. "Did the board vote to build on Lot 18? She shifted the folder in her hands and said, "The board approved the pavilion concept." Again, not what I asked. I asked whether they had approved that location. She said the exact footprint had been delegated. That told me everything. Nobody had wanted to check too carefully. I said, "No one is pouring concrete on my land." She looked at me for a long second, then said, "If we stop now, it's going to create unnecessary cost." And that was the real truth finally slipping out. Not community. Not beauty. Not shared use. Cost. They were already too far in. And she wanted me to absorb the risk so the project wouldn't get messy. I told her to leave. Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of diesel. The kind of sound that reaches your bones before your brain names it. I grabbed my phone, my boots, my plat map sleeve, and headed straight for the back lot. By the time I got there, they had already poured the first slab. That is not dramatic wording. That is exactly what happened. The truck was backing out. The surface was fresh. A laborer was finishing the edge. Dana stood on the common strip talking to a landscaping rep, like they were unveiling a gift to the neighborhood. I walked straight past her and said to the foreman, "I am the owner of Lot 18. This slab is on my parcel. You are now on notice that this work is unauthorized." He looked sick. Dana told me not to create a scene. I told her, "A scene is wet concrete on land you do not own." The landscaping rep introduced himself and said they had been given site direction by the association. I said, "Show me the site plan with parcel lines." He didn't have one. He had a concept sketch, a placement diagram, nothing that actually tied the slab to a verified boundary. That distinction matters. The contractor was careless. Dana was reckless. Those are not the same thing. I took more photos. Wide angles. Close angles. The fresh slab against the rear tree line. The relationship to the drainage swale. The old fence reference. The common strip edge. Then I called County Planning and Development and left a formal site complaint. Not because I expected someone to appear in 10 minutes. Because I wanted a timestamp. Then I emailed Marlene again. This time I wrote, "Concrete has now been poured on Lot 18. This is a formal demand that all work stop immediately. Pending boundary verification." Then I stopped waiting for the HOA to fix itself and started building the file that would force everyone else to look. I pulled my closing survey, printed the plat, printed the grading exhibit, pulled the county parcel map, checked the online permit portal. There was a permit, issued 3 days earlier. Site improvement. Passive pavilion pad. Willow Bend HOA Common Greenbelt. At first glance it sounded legitimate. That's how bad paperwork works. Sounds legitimate first. But when I opened the attached documents, the problem was obvious. The permit referenced the HOA common parcel. The uploaded sketch was conceptual. No sealed site plan. No measured relationship to adjoining parcels. No setback note. No drainage notation. No boundary confirmation. Enough to sound official. Not enough to justify pouring concrete wherever Dana pointed. I downloaded the permit file and saved everything into my folder. Then I called the survey company from my original closing packet. They were booked out. I told the receptionist there was active encroachment and a fresh slab on my parcel. She put me on hold. 10 minutes later, she came back and said they could send a field tech Monday morning for a boundary confirmation. Good enough. Then I sent the email that changed the whole tone of the case. To Marlene. To the board president. To the landscaping vendor office. To the contractor office. And to the county permit review email listed in the portal. Subject: Formal notice of encroachment / permit scope concern / lot 18 inside. I wrote exactly what had happened. A concrete slab had been poured on the rear portion of lot 18. The contractor stated that placement was directed by association contact Dana Mercer. The permit file referenced common area, but did not establish authorization to occupy lot 18. I had requested county review and scheduled boundary verification. All further work must cease immediately. That email mattered because it changed who I was in the story. Before that, I was just the homeowner objecting. After that, I was the person holding dates, documents, permit screenshots, parcel references, and a coming survey confirmation. People start answering differently when they realize you are building a file instead of an argument. Marlene finally replied that afternoon. She said the matter was under review and the vendor had been instructed to pause further work until the location was confirmed. Pause further work. Not remove. Not admit. Pause. Fine. Monday morning, the survey tech arrived just after 8. His name was Eli. Quiet. Practical. Sun-faded cap. The kind of man who trusted metal and measurements more than people. He asked me to show him my corners. I walked him down the side yard and out to the rear line, where one of the old iron pins from my original survey was still buried under dirt and grass. He swept the area with a locator, marked the spot, dug with a narrow hand spade and hit metal. That little click against the buried pin sounded better than any victory speech. Then he found the second reference. Then he ran the line. The slab was not close. It was not borderline. It was on my parcel by just under 14 feet at the deepest point. And the near edge crossed directly over the drainage path shown in the original grading materials. Eli stood there for a second, looked at the slab and said very calmly, "That's not where they thought it was." I laughed, because that was the politest possible version of a much bigger problem. He marked the line with bright paint, took photos, prepared a field note, said the formal sketch could be turned around the next day. I didn't need the finished sketch to know what came next. I needed the photos of survey paint crossing a brand new slab. So I sent them. Not to the neighborhood. Not to Facebook. Not to the community page. That is where people sabotage themselves. They go public too soon because they want emotional satisfaction. I sent the photos only to the people now holding real exposure. The manager. The board president. The vendor. The contractor. The county. Subject: Boundary confirmed. Slab located on lot 18 / drainage path impact. That phrase mattered. Not just encroachment. Drainage path impact. Because that's where the problem became bigger than a property spat. Now it was an ownership issue and a function issue. Land line and stormwater. At 12:42 the board president Tom Weller called me himself. Tom was one of those men who always looked like leadership had happened to him accidentally. Nice enough. A little tired. Too conflict avoidant for the job he had. He sounded worn out before he even got to my name. "Claire," he said, "I've reviewed the materials." I said, "Then you know the slab is on my property." He exhaled. "Yes. No hedging." That helped. Then he tried to soften it. He said there seemed to have been some confusion about the rear area classification. I said, "There was no confusion. There was no boundary verification." That shut him up for a second. Then he admitted Dana had represented the rear area as part of an association improvement zone behind the greenbelt. Improvement zone. Her wording again. Not legal language. Not recorded language. Just the sort of phrase people invent when they've been acting powerful for too long without anyone checking them. I asked Tom whether the board had voted to place a slab on lot 18. He said no. I asked whether any board approval authorized work on private property. He said no. I asked whether the permit had been checked against actual parcel lines before the concrete was poured. Silence. Then, "Not to my knowledge." That was it. The whole thing in one neat chain of negligence. A vague concept had been approved. Dana pushed location. A contractor followed verbal direction. No one checked the line. A permit was filed loosely enough to sound official. Concrete was poured. And now everybody was trying to figure out whose mistake was most expensive. Tom asked what resolution I wanted. I said, removal, full restoration, written confirmation, and no further rear area work adjacent to Lot 18 without boundary verification and owner notice. He said they would discuss next steps. I said, this is not a discussion issue. The slab is on my land and across a drainage path. Then I stopped talking. That matters too. You do not need a longer speech once the facts are better than your emotions. The next few days were the most revealing part of the whole story. The vendor sent a careful email explaining that site placement had been based on association provided field direction. Translation: not our line. Not our call. The contractor office sent an even clearer one saying they had relied on site staking and verbal placement confirmation, and were not supplied with a sealed boundary exhibit. Translation: somebody pointed. We trusted them. That somebody was wrong. Marlene got very formal. She asked for copies of my survey documents and requested that the association attorney review the encroachment issue. That's how you know the mood has shifted. Not when people apologize. When lawyers start reviewing attachments. Then County Development Review flagged the permit for site discrepancy and scheduled inspection. That happened because the file was coherent. That is a point worth repeating. Agencies do not reward the loudest person. They respond faster to the cleanest package. A county inspector named Halpern came out that Wednesday. Khakis. Clipboard. A look on his face that suggested he had seen too many people act surprised by rules they never bothered to read. He walked the painted line, looked at the slab, reviewed the grading note, and then asked the question that broke the whole fantasy apart. Who approved placing hardscape across the drainage swale? Not who approved the pavilion. Hardscape across the drainage swale. That's because by then, ownership was only half the problem. The county cared about water. Always water. Tom was there. Marlene was there. The vendor rep was there. Dana arrived late in a visor and sunglasses, which would have been funny if I hadn't been so tired. She tried to explain that the area had always functioned as neighborhood overflow. Halpern asked, without even looking up from his notes, "Is that phrase in any recorded document?" Silence. He crouched by the slab edge, looked at the grade, and compared the permit sketch to the actual placement. Then he said, "This permit references common area improvement. It does not authorize work on an adjoining private parcel, and it does not waive drainage performance requirements." That tone, calm, irritated, precise, is the tone that costs people money. He asked if any revised plan had been submitted. No. Any owner consent document? No. Any drainage review for actual installed placement? No. 3 no's in a row. By Friday, the county had issued a correction notice tied to the permit. No dramatic sirens. Just the kind of quiet administrative language that ruins weekends. Work outside approved area. Unauthorized encroachment. Drainage impact concern. Corrective action required before continuation. That was enough. The board attorney called that afternoon. Polite. Measured. Very careful. He said the association was prepared to arrange removal of the slab and restoration of the disturbed area at association expense. I asked for 3 things in writing. Removal date. Restoration scope. Written confirmation that no future work would proceed near the rear line without verified boundary review and owner notice. He said that was reasonable. I did not tell him how funny that sounded after a week of people acting like my property was negotiable. Then came one of the most satisfying parts. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so revealing. Tom accidentally forwarded me a draft remediation email chain with earlier replies still attached. Buried in it was Dana complaining that I had escalated to the county before giving the beautification committee a chance to resolve the matter internally. Internally. There is no internal process for pouring concrete on somebody else's land. Especially not when the concrete cuts across a drainage path. I did not respond to that thread. I didn't need to. Reality was already doing the work. The slab removal was scheduled for Tuesday. And then, just to make sure everyone fully understood what they had built over, it rained. A slow, steady rain. Nothing historic. Just enough. By dawn the next day, runoff was already tracing the usual path across the rear slope. Toward the swale. Toward the low section. And because the slab interrupted that path, Water began backing and curling around the edge into the disturbed soil. Nothing cinematic. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make the function of that ugly little rear strip obvious to anybody who still wanted to pretend it was dead space. By the time Halpern stopped by for a follow-up look, the slab was already ringed with soft washout and a shallow sediment fan. He looked down, then muttered, "There it is." 3 words. That was enough. The ground itself had become evidence. And that is the kind of payoff I trust. Not revenge. Reality. Removal day was ugly in exactly the right way. Concrete saws. A breaker. A skid steer. Fresh slab cut into chunks because someone had decided close enough was the same thing as approved. I watched from the rear line while the same crew that had poured so confidently now worked in near silence. To their credit, the foreman walked over before they started and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry this happened." I told him, "I know this wasn't your boundary call. Because blame matters. If you spread it carelessly, you weaken the truth." They cut the slab, lifted the sections, removed the forms, pulled out the pallets of decorative stone that had been staged nearby, backfilled, regrade, reseeded. I took my own photos from every angle and made sure the board attorney's written confirmation included follow-up inspection after the next substantial rain event. Because removal is not restoration. A lot of people miss that. A neat-looking patch of dirt on a dry day can become a washout the second weather returns. The first follow-up rain exposed a shallow rut near the swale edge where equipment had compacted too hard. I photographed it, sent it, and they corrected that too. Quietly. No drama. No speech. Just cost. Which, in my experience, is the only language people like Dana ever hear all the way through. The board never publicly denounced her. Neighborhoods almost never do things that cleanly. But she disappeared from the beautification committee within a month. The next quarterly minutes referred to a committee restructuring. Then a new project policy appeared. Any proposed common area improvement adjacent to private lots required documented boundary verification and manager review before vendor mobilization. Imagine that. A rule. For the exact thing I had begged them to do before anyone poured concrete. Dana also stopped walking the path. Stopped offering opinions about my back lot. Stopped hovering at meetings with her binder. Stopped speaking like every part of the neighborhood was hers to interpret. The one time we ended up alone again was at the mail kiosk about 6 weeks later. It was dusk. The cicadas were loud. The light had that tired summer glow right before it gives up for the evening. She picked up her mail, stood beside me for a second and said without looking at me, "The pavilion would have been nice for the community." I slid one envelope into my stack and said, "Then it should have been built on community land." That was all. No need for more. Because by then the truth was already sitting in board emails, county files, contractor notes, correction notices, and a line of new grass growing where a slab had never belonged. That is the part one want people to hear clearly. Especially if you live in an HOA. Especially if you are quiet. Especially if people mistake your calm for softness. The most dangerous thing you can be in a property dispute is not louder. It is organized. People like Dana depend on a very specific reaction. They expect outrage. They expect public drama. They expect you to become difficult. They expect the emotional story to overpower the factual one. What they do not expect is someone who builds a file. Photos with dates. Parcel maps. Permit screenshots. Survey confirmation. Targeted emails. Clear written demands. No extra noise. That is how you move a story from annoyance to consequence. Because once the facts are clean enough, the weight shifts. The contractor gets careful. The vendor gets factual. The manager gets formal. The board gets nervous. The county gets interested. That is the real reversal. Not humiliation. Liability. So if you ever walk onto your property and find something that should not be there, a fence, a trench, a gate, a slab, a pile of materials, a crew acting too comfortable, do not waste your best first move on outrage. Take the photos. Check the permit. Pull the plat. Mark the time. Build the file. And make sure the people with real exposure understand exactly what they are standing on. Because land disputes are not usually won by the person who sounds the most offended. They are won by the person who can answer 3 boring questions better than everyone else. Where is the line? Who approved what? What changed on the ground? That is the whole machine. Where is the line? Who approved what? What changed on the ground? Answer those three things cleanly, and half the power people build around themselves starts collapsing before you ever raise your voice. And I'll tell you something else. That ugly little back lot? The patch Dana thought didn't read like private yard? I appreciate it more now than I ever did before. Not because I'm sentimental about a drainage swale. Because the land told the truth before any of them did. The records confirmed it. The survey proved it. The county enforced it. But the land told it first. It held the water. It showed the grade. It exposed the arrogance. It corrected the story the second somebody tried to pave over function with aesthetics. That is why I still walk the back line after storms. Boots. Coffee. Damp grass. The grass came back thicker after the restoration. The grade is cleaner now. In a strange way, their mistake forced them to fix a small shoulder that had probably been building for years near the swale edge. So yes, the whole mess improved the function of that area in the end. Just not in the way Dana planned. And every now and then, when the morning light hits at the right angle, I can still see the faintest difference in the soil where that slab once sat. A ghost rectangle. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. A reminder that somebody thought concept art was stronger than a parcel line. That somebody thought an underused area was the same as available land. That somebody thought private property stopped being private if enough people found it inconvenient. And that somebody learned very expensively that concrete feels permanent right up until the survey paint cuts across it. So if you ever find yourself in a fight like this, remember the order. Not anger first. Evidence first. Not the speech. The file. Because the strongest kind of justice in these situations is rarely loud. It doesn't need a dramatic reveal. Sometimes it's just wet concrete, an old iron pin in the dirt, and a county inspector asking one quiet question nobody prepared for. Who approved this? Here. In my case, nobody who actually had the right. And that was enough. More than enough. By the time I reached my back lot, they had already poured the first slab. But by the time the county was done with it, they were cutting it back out in pieces. And that was the day the ugly little strip behind Lot 18 stopped being underused space and became what it had always been. Mine.